Hey everybody, welcome to yet another Dining Room Chalkboard lecture. It is day 67 on the count up, and that's starting to feel big. But more importantly, it is now week 8 of the course, which means that first of all, the term is pretty much almost over. It's going to go very quickly. Second of all, this is the third and final part of the class, which is really for the purposes of this remote instruction model, the most challenging part of this class. This is where, if we were able to get together, we were going to spend some time today, or whatever day you're watching this is not today, on Tuesday of this week, we were going to spend that time with me discussing the plan, the City Club plan to revise the Portland Charter, and then kind of getting you guys ready to do your group work, and then spending the next few classes with you actually in class, working with your groups, doing the online discussion board is kind of an adjunct to that, so that you could have a required set of interactions so that outside of class, so that your group work could be richer. Obviously that plan isn't going to happen, and I had kind of hoped to try to just translate that plan into the remote model by doing a lecture today, as I have been the video lectures, and then just giving you time to do your group work remotely, and then when we were going to do the final presentations, having a Zoom meeting for the final presentations, because what I really would love is for everybody to see everybody else's plans, so that you can get a sense of how differently it's possible to approach the question of what should the Portland city government look like going forward into the rest of the 21st century. And you could also see some of the ways in which you guys came to similar conclusions. The idea of having a Zoom meeting instead of presentations, as it gets closer and as I kind of thought about the weight and difficulty of the term coming to an end, got me to reconceive the entirety of the rest of the term. Not completely. I want to still try to keep going with what we're going with to a certain extent, but I made some changes, and I made an announcement on the D2L site where it's below where this video lecture is, so you hopefully have seen it. I changed the calendar, and the deadlines should all be reflected there, but I know there's a lot of written information, and I just want to go through this quickly, as well as then to do what I would have done if we were in class this week, is talk about what my expectations are for the group work, and given in light of the fact that now you're going to be doing it not in class, but actually outside of class, and totally online without ever having met probably your group members. So first of all, this week was supposed to have 2 deadlines. Today, I keep saying today, it's not even today. Today's Monday on my time. Today being Tuesday, the day that you would be having this class. But Tuesday, the 19th, was supposed to be the evaluation essay due. And the original idea was that I was going to discuss the City Club's report on changing the charter, and I wanted you to come in having read it and written an evaluation essay on it. So you had your ideas, and then you could see my ideas, and that way you would come in prepared to sort of have an informed position already. In light of the global pandemic and remote instruction, while that is still a great goal, things have totally changed in my view. So the evaluation essay is due next Tuesday. If you've already turned it in, you can turn in another one. If you haven't turned it in yet, you now have one whole extra week. And my expectation now is that you will use the content of today's lecture as part of your set of ideas, or at least you'll have my picture on what it is that the task of reforming the Portland city government is. Whereas before, I wanted you to kind of tackle that on your own before you heard what I had to say about it, and just based on the assigned reading from the City Club report. So that the whole intention of the paper has changed. The assignment hasn't changed. You still need to write an evaluation of the report from your own perspective. It's just that now you're not going to be doing it before you have professorial instruction on this, but afterwards. You were also supposed to, by Thursday, at the beginning of class, have an initial proposal online on the online discussion forum for one change that you want to see. And that's important that it's one change. Your online discussion was going to kick off with you, each member of your group, proposing just one change. And however big or small, hopefully it's not minuscule, right? But for example, changing perhaps the method of electing city council members from at-large to district-based. That's one single change. And the idea was, again, for this one, the original idea was that on Thursday you were going to come in and have a group discussion of the city club plan and begin moving forward on your own group's plan. Because the idea of this group is that you do what the city club committee did, is that you sit down and you think through the idea of what would a new city charter look like for the city of Portland going forward. What would improve the kind of city government that we have? What would address the problems that we can see with the current system, which is now a century old, and also what would address what is coming for Portland? What kind of city that we want it to become? What kind of city it's already becoming? Population growth, economic expansion, cultural change, demographic change. All of these things are coming. So the idea of the group project is still the same. That you as a small group are going to act as a committee that has been assigned to write a report, analogous to the report that the City Club wrote, and having virtue of the City Club report's work. I'm gesturing in this direction, I realize, because that's where my City Club report is sitting. Here it is. So you're supposed to read this first of all. Now, the original idea of the initial discussion posting was that you, again, by yourself, before you got with your group, would think through the report. You would have written the evaluation essay already, and then you would say, okay, well, what's one change I think is really important? And then you would put that on the group discussion board, and then you would read everyone else's ideas in your group, and you would respond to them, and then they would read yours and respond to you. And so it was kind of an adjunct to the in-class discussions and whatever other kind of discussions you would conduct informally outside of class, so that it was all intended to be one continuous in-class, online discussion of the City of Portland's form of government for roughly a week and a half. And then at the end, your group would come in and present your plan to the rest of the class, and each of the groups would do that, and then we would have a discussion at the end about the different plans, and not necessarily form a whole class plan. Like, that wasn't the idea. That was never the intention, was that we would, as a class, then create our own plan, but to just see what the 4 different versions are, where they are different, where they overlap. You could hear other groups' ideas and be like, oh yeah, we didn't think of that, or we thought of that and we rejected that, and we still reject it, or wow, no, actually that's pretty convincing. So that was the idea. The way it's now going to go is that the online discussion is really, it's still an adjunct to your group work, but it's not as synced up in time as it would be, because the very first assignment, the initial proposal, is not due until Tuesday, May 26th, at which point you should already have been interacting with your group, because you should start this week. After you watch this video lecture or listen to the audio version, you should try engaging with your group. In fact, maybe you've already started engaging with your group, seeing what's coming and knowing that group work is a slog at best under normal circumstances, and it's going to be even more challenging under the current circumstances. But your initial proposal isn't due until Tuesday, next Tuesday, at 11:59 p.m., so the end of the day. And so you should already be well along in your group work. And so now the online discussion is really kind of a separate set-aside. It's instead of being a place where you workshop ideas that could then inform your group work, it's really a place where you as an individual are going to be proposing ideas, reading other people's ideas, responding and critiquing them, and then responding to people's critiques of yours. So while you're also going to, at the same time, be interacting with your group members about a lot of these same issues, these two assignments no longer mesh as tightly as they possibly can, or as they were originally intended to be. So all the deadlines for the discussion postings have been bumped back by 5 days. So instead of the first one being due on Thursday, the first one's due the following Tuesday, and the deadline has been changed from 8 a.m., which was when our class was supposed to be, to 11:59 p.m., which is a more traditional, in my approach anyway, a more traditional deadline for online discussion type of stuff. And part of the reason why it was going to be 8 a.m. is I wanted you to do all that work before you arrived in class, so that you would have had that online interaction before you then sat down with your group members. Now, since you're not sitting down with your group members, it doesn't make any sense to have you do the work before you don't sit down. The other thing that's happened is that your final paper has been pushed back by 2 days, only 2 days. It was moved from Tuesday, June 2nd to Thursday, June 4th, and the time that was due was always 11:59 p.m., so that hasn't changed. So that deadline's only moved 2 days, so don't think that everything is moved by 5 days. The evaluation paper has been moved by 7 days, from Tuesday to Tuesday, and 7 days plus hours, 7 days because it was due originally discussions have been moved by 5 days, and then the final paper has been moved by 2 days. The last change is that the method of presentation of your group's plan for reforming the Portland City government is no longer going to be a Zoom meeting. Originally, at the beginning of the course, I determined that I wasn't going to do Zoom meetings for regular classes. I was going to do lectures from here in my dining room, and I think that's worked out pretty well. It's become increasingly difficult for me to get prepared and get motivated to do this as this quarantine is worn on, and as like full motivation for every act of my job has to come from inside my willpower, as opposed to like, oh, well, I just have to be there. I have to go to school. I drop my kids off at school. I go to my job. All of that motivation has had to come in from the inside, and I'm sure that many of you are also experiencing the kind of challenge that poses as each week goes by. And I'm just like, I can't imagine doing these Zoom meetings now and having them fulfill my intention, which is what I want everybody to see everybody else's work, so that they can get a perspective on how many different ways you can approach reforming the Portland City government, and also on places where you guys landed on similar ideas, so that you can see the similarities and differences. That goal hasn't changed. The method of achieving that goal can be easily changed, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to have each of the groups turn in to a newly created discussion forum, which is still inside, it's in the same discussion thread or forum as the group discussion work that you're going to have to do, but it's just a separate one for final presentations. Each group will turn in one final presentation, and everybody can therefore have access to the other three groups. There's going to be no sort of enforced watching of it, because you won't have to be in a room or on a Zoom meeting while it's happening. But my hope and my expectation is that you will go and watch the presentation of the other three groups, so that you get this final sort of piece of learning about political reform that I'm hoping to deliver to you. The way that you can turn in your presentations vary. And I want to talk a little bit about the method of doing this. For those of you who have the capacity and the desire to do a screen recording, you can, if you have a Macintosh, I know how to do this on Macintosh, so I'll talk you through it. You open QuickTime, and you can start a screen recording, and you can either record your whole screen, or you can record just a window. And I'm not obviously walking you through it, but it's relatively easy in the Macintosh to do a screen recording. And then you can just start a PowerPoint presentation, or you can start a Google Slides presentation, or you can start whatever kind of presentation that you want to make. You can use PDF files, you can use Word files, whatever. Essentially, the screen recording will share your screen, and then just do an audio over top of it. That's one method, a screen recorded presentation. It's probably the most straightforward, easy method. You could also do what I'm doing, which is use a phone to record one member of the group, or even maybe you could use a phone to record, the group could be like, well, I'll do the introduction, I'll do this part, I'll do this part. That's a little more challenging than just picking one person to do the final presentation, but that person can do the final presentation in front of the phone with, they can actually, have something behind them, or I don't quite know how that would work, or you could just hold up printouts of what your slides would look like. You don't really even need slides. You could actually do this presentation without a slide presentation. Or you could put together a slide deck, either in Google Slides or in PowerPoint, and you can record an audio and send both of those things in the same posting. And in the audio, what you would want to do is you would essentially do a self-guided tour. You would say, okay, start on slide number 1, and then talk, and then when you're ready to change, you say, change the slide, so that the audience listening to you, watching, can change the slide on their own computer. So that's a way of doing it without a screen recording. Or if there's some other method that you can think of that's not one of these, that would make a presentation to the class that would get across what it is that your plan is supposed to be, you can do whatever will get that across. The only thing I don't want is just a purely written report. I don't want all of us to have to just read some document that has a bunch of words and subheadings and maybe even charts or diagrams. That's the only thing that I don't want. I probably should open up my mind and say, well, under these circumstances, that would be acceptable. But I do want you to try to find something that is visual, audio, interactive, that gets the rest of the class engaged in your presentation, even though it is not going to be done in front of them live. The simplest version is what I would do normally, which is on the day of the class, you come up, you have your slide deck, either one or more people from the group gets up and does the presentation like a traditional college presentation. So you will have to find a method, but I am fully prepared to accept anything except for just a plain old written report. If you need guidance in which method to choose, how to make that method happen, how to execute on that method, please reach out to me. I am definitely not an expert at this kind of thing, but I'm a pretty decent amateur, as I hope that you can tell from the kind of stuff I've done for this class. I have a pretty good ability to figure out how to make this happen, and I understand the various technological capacities and constraints involved in like a laptop and a phone that most people have access to. So if you can do this on your own, great. I'm not begging you to come asking me for help to put your final presentation together, but I certainly want to be available as a technical resource. Even though that's not my job, I have that ability to do that. Okay. I put all that in writing on announcements and on the calendar and all this stuff, but I know that sometimes it can just be a lot to see. I certainly have myself gotten email fatigue from all of the emails that I've gotten about meetings and college business and all that stuff, so it's sometimes nice just to have somebody just describe it to you. That said, send me an email and if there's something that you need to have elaborated on. I don't check my email as often as I normally would, and I try to get back to you all within 24 hours, and sometimes that just doesn't happen. Sometimes it's just the case that I can't open my laptop and look at my email, and I'm sure that you all are feeling, or many of you are feeling, a similar kind of just like walking through mud up to your necks. And I understand that, and I'm definitely way more forgiving than I ever have been, and it's possible that one of the things the pandemic will change is that I will become I will become a truly forgiving person for students who have all kinds of trouble. Because in the past, and many of you who know me will know that I would just be like, look, you're a college student, you just got to make it work, right? That was my tough love approach. In my heart of hearts, I'm still a tough love person, but it could be that the global pandemic is actually eroding the tough love side of me. Okay, so the last thing we are doing in this class, and we have 3 weeks to do it, is evaluating the City Club's plan, their analysis, and their plan, their recommendations, and thinking through the very same problem that the City Club Committee thought through on our own. And today, I'm not going to give you a plan. I'm going to give you essentially the outlines of what a plan should look like, what the expectation is for the kind of political reform you'll be thinking your way through. Now, remember, political reform, as I've defined it for this class and as I've used it the entire time, is a transformation in the way that decisions are made within the political system, not in what the decisions are, right? That's regular policy reform, right? If we're going to approach the idea of urban development, if we're going to approach the idea of parks funding, if we're going to approach the idea of the homelessness problem or of school development, those are all policy issues. And if you're going to change the way the homeless population is dealt with and treated and served and regulated, that's policy reform. Political reform changes the way those changes are made. The current system that we have in Portland is a commission system, and you should know this from your reading, and if you haven't done the reading yet, that's fine, because normally I would have expected it today, but things are changed. But the system that Portland has was a result of progressive era reforms, which both Oregon and Portland were at the forefront of a century ago, a little more than a century ago. And the idea of the commissioner system was that the old form of city government, which was very much tied to political machines and was highly corrupt in the sense that city contracts were not awarded in a way that was competitive, and there wasn't really openness or transparency, Things did get done. Actually, corruption, the word corruption usually makes it seem like government is super ineffective and money's just being stolen left and right. It doesn't have to happen that way. What happens with, sort of more routine, I would say American-style corruption, is that the job gets done. It just gets done in a less competitive environment. It gets done also in a way where there are mutual benefits handed out. So for example, one of the reasons why city contracts were so highly guarded by political machines is that political machines could get support from people who expected in return for that support votes. They would get no-bid city contracts, and so they would deliver votes for contracts, and that's corruption. What did happen was that people voted, so it was really still a democratic system. They weren't faking votes. They weren't creating fraudulent ballots. No one was being physically coerced. People were just being promised benefits, right? If you vote for these guys who will give me a contract, I will give you a job that pays money from that contract. So there was this sort of iron triangle, cozy relationship. It's corrupt. I definitely don't want to say that it's not corrupt, but it's not the kind of just totally extraction-based, decadent, wasteful, destructive corruption that exists in other places and has existed in the United States, but largely doesn't. But the commission system of government was intended to create more popular check on and participation in municipal government, so that this kind of cozy iron triangle sort of corruption would be mitigated. It was, at the time, probably the biggest problem with municipal government was this sort of cozy relationship between contractors and parties and voters and party machines and elected officials, so that what we didn't really have was either competition in the democratic sphere. Elections weren't fixed in the sense that votes were fraudulently put in. They were fixed in the sense that people were incentivized to vote in one direction or another, but they weren't really competitive. And the contracts and city work, municipal work, also wasn't very competitive. And as a result, it was more expensive than it needed to be, and it was less high quality. So it was a waste to the taxpayers. So the idea was create a system where there would be greater both democratic competition as well as competition for city contracts and city work. That is no longer the main problem with municipal government around the United States, and it is definitely no longer the problem with Portland city government. We're not really worried about this kind of cozy relationship between contractors and elected officials, and party machines don't really get people elected, and we don't have this all-around lack of competition. So one of the things to ask yourself as you go into this project, we have a system of government that was designed to fix a problem that we don't have anymore. And it's no wonder that that form of government no longer seems to be the appropriate one. It would be pretty lucky if you devise a machine to fix a problem, and that problem goes away, and then that machine actually fixes the new problems that arise. That's not typically how things work with either machines, physical machines, or with human systems. For example, in a totally different area, the system of tenure for professors was devised to solve a problem, and it solved that problem. It solved the problem of lack of intellectual freedom and of sort of institutional power over the research and ideas of professors. And it solved that problem. It doesn't solve the other problems that now exist in the academy that have developed, one, because of the success of the tenure system, because sometimes when you solve a problem, the solution creates a whole new set of problems, and then sometimes you solve a problem, and then a new problem comes from a totally different direction, and your old solution certainly can't be, it would be lucky if, and sometimes it does, but it doesn't always solve the new problem. So one of the first things you should be asking yourself, and the City Club definitely, they do a big tour of various kinds of systems and the history of this, but one of the things they approach this with is, what is the problem that we think that the Portland city government has right now? Not municipal government all across the country, but what's the problem that we have now? So addressing the problem, the contemporary problems. what do you think is wrong? And this is something that I've mentioned early in the term and have kind of implied throughout, is this is really the way that political reform movements get going. There's a problem that gets addressed, and then we say, okay, well, what are the causes of that problem within the current system? And what new kinds of political procedures, what new kinds of institutions, what new kinds of roles, what new kinds of regulations would address this problem without, one, creating worse problems, or two, only addressing it partially or only addressing one problem while ignoring the other one, recognizing also typically that many things are interconnected. Now, this is not something I've talked about much in this class, but addressing contemporary problems and look for interconnections. Now, that's sort of the overall landscape of what you're doing as you enter this task of saying, well, we want to have a new plan for what the Portland City government will look like in the future. The first thing you have to do is know what it looks like in the present, and we have the commissioner system, and I've just kind of laid out for you the fact that it solved a problem. It was designed to address a problem, and it actually successfully solved a problem with municipal government, but that's roughly a century ago. That's the progressive era solution to the problems that kind of gave rise to progressive era reform concerns. We clearly in the 21st century have a different set of concerns. Portland is also an obviously very different city in the 2020s than it was in the 1900s, the 19-teens, the 1920s. So we know that there's a new landscape. But what are we doing? We're not proposing policy changes. We're not saying, well, the police are racist, or we have too much homelessness, or there's a budget shortfall, or we don't have adequate schools, or housing developers are too highly unregulated. There's too much free market solutions. Those are all problems. So addressing contemporary problems is not about policy problems. It's about how our political system responds to or fails to respond to the policy problems it faces. So what you're not doing is offering policy reforms. You're not looking at a plan for dealing with racism in the police department, or with homelessness, or with public school funding, or whatever the problem, development, whatever problems you might think there are out there. You're looking at what will allow the city government to respond more effectively to those kinds of problems, right? So if gentrification is one of the things that drives you crazy about Portland, and you think this is a problem, we're not offering a solution to gentrification. What you're thinking about, though, is you can think about those more concrete policy problems by saying, what is it about our current system that makes our city government not as responsive to gentrification as we would like it to be? What makes our city government unable to address things like inadequately funded parks, if that's what your problem is, or with a lack of concern for developers doing whatever they want as far as putting in things with no parking, etc. Don't think through the problem. Think through what it is that would make a good environment, a good political environment for solving that problem. Or for not even solving it, for addressing that problem. And one of the things about political reform is that when you create a new political form, when you succeed as a political reformer, you don't necessarily win the battles that subsequently follow your success at political reform. So, for example, if one of the problems you thought, and this is about a century-old problem, it's contemporaneous to our system, our commission system of government. If you think that one of the problems with our political system is that the government is not responsive enough to the will of the people, and so what we need as a solution to that is direct democracy. We need an initiative, we need a referendum, we need recalls, and you win that battle. You get direct democracy installed in your state constitution or in your city charter. That's a victory. That doesn't mean that when it comes to, say, battling for a particular ballot measure, that you're going to win. Right? You've created, by succeeding at changing the political system, you've created a new opportunity for winning policy battles, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to win them. So when you think about reforming the Portland City government, also keep in mind that what you're doing is you're changing the nature of the arena. You're changing the nature of the game but it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to, that game is going to have a particular outcome. And you shouldn't even, if you want a particular outcome, you shouldn't be a political reformer, right? If you want to fight gentrification, don't become a political reformer who changes the system hoping that the new system will address gentrification the way you want to address it. But if you look at gentrification and say the failure of the Portland city government to respond adequately to gentrification and what it's doing to our culture, what it's doing to marginalized communities, what it's doing to the demographic distribution of income levels in our city, like, it's not doing a good job responding. I want a more responsive government. Now, the policies that might come out of a more responsive government might actually not be ones that you particularly favor. So political reform is, in a way, it's a dangerous game, because if you win, you might still not win the changes that you want. But what you're doing is you're looking to make it be more X, right? Now, I've used the word responsiveness because one of the things I think that is an underlying concern for most political reformers in America is a system of government that is more responsive to X, right? I was just about to say to the will of the people, but that's one version of what fills in that blank. More responsive to, right? One of the things that the progressive era reforms were designed to do was to be more responsive to the voice of the people, but also it was designed to be more expert driven, more responsive to the voice of experts and technocrats, because there was a big part of the progressive era that was about trusting technical scientific expertise as opposed to just making a system more democratic. So part of what the system that we have in place was a result of a political reform that was oriented towards being, yes, more responsive to the regular voter, to the people, not to their representatives, who were seen as largely having ties to, one, political machines, and two, to moneyed interests. More responsive to voters, but also more responsive to technocratic expertise. Part of the reason why you want to think about what are the problems is what is it that we don't think our city government is doing, right? What is it lacking, and how, through a political system, a change in political system, can we get more of that, right? So one of the things about, for example, the idea, the desire to have more responsiveness to technical and scientific expertise. How do you do that? How do you create a system that is more responsive to that? Well, the general solution is you have more appointed officials. You have people who are appointed to do work, not elected, and you design the system of appointment to incentivize choosing technical and scientific experts as opposed to choosing popular elected officials, or or as opposed to choosing people that you have a tight, cozy, or family relationship with. Right? Part of the commission system was so that there wasn't this sort of buddy-buddy trading of benefits, so that the people who were running city governments were actually technical and scientific experts. Now, we might think from a different perspective that there are certain positions where we actually want less technocracy and more populism. We want the people who are making decisions to be more responsive to the concerns of voters and less responsive to the thoughts and ideas of technical and scientific experts. So part of what is going to happen when you're thinking about the contemporary problems and the interconnections between all of the different things you see are wrong is that you're going to be making value-based decisions. You can say, yeah, we want more populism, we want more technical and scientific expertise, we want more stability, we want more possibility for change. This is one of the trade-offs I talked about when talking about constitutional avenues of reform. What are the possible things that you could look for, and what are the trade-offs? Now, that's again kind of a more general overview kind of consideration. What are we looking for? The thing that you're actually doing is this. We're creating a system of government, and then we're also creating a system of elections. And each of these involves certain specific decisions. So the system of governance for the city charter is really about what is the nature of the legislative branch and the executive, and then what's the relationship between these two. And elections are about who gets elected and how. And also, who doesn't get elected and how, right? And that's actually where the two come together, where we talk about appointments. Who isn't elected? And how are they chosen? There's also kind of in the background of all of this, which is really connected to both who's elected, what's the relationship, how are they chosen. There's also the question of checks on power. What are the checks on power going to look like? Who gets elected and how. The governance also is legislative executive systems, the relationship, and then there's also the question of extra governmental forms. So one common thing that exists in certain systems is that there is, the legislative branch makes the laws, the executive branch enforces the laws and carries out the programs and does all the on-the-ground work. And then in some systems, there's the judiciary is relied on as the check. In other systems, the legislative is relied on as the check. In other systems, there's an extra governmental form, which is some kind of inspector general, or some kind of citizen review panel, or some kind of ombudsman, something that checks the power, right? And these are, I should have probably put this over here, but this is a form of check. One thing about, it's already like, it's supposed to be simple. What's the city government look like? That could be a simple set of questions. What's the mayor? What's the mayor's role? How many members of the city council? How are they elected? There are those questions do need to be answered, but there's also then the broader picture of where is our system of governance embedded in terms of internal and external checks on power. So checks on power, internal and external. And this is diagram, I did not plan this diagram out very well. One of the external checks on power is the electoral system, of course, because elections check power. If you have a bunch of elected officials and they have to come up for re-election, that's a check on their power. An internal system of checks and balances is the relationship between the different branches and each other, so they check each other's power. And then this is also then a form of external and internal checks, because it's external because it's extra governmental forms. They're essentially outside, not outside the government itself, but they're outside the standard system of governance. But they're also a regular part. They are there, they exist. Elections are sporadic, right? These kinds of things are ongoing. I know that I'm losing all the things that I've been holding together for the last 7.5 weeks, because this diagram is absolutely, undoubtedly the worst diagram I've produced all term. Maybe I should just, at the end of this, maybe I should redraw it, take a picture of that, and post that with the notes. But boy, even as I say that just sounds like a lot to do. I'm sorry if I seem like I'm burned out or I've given up. I'm neither burned out nor have I given up, but I see burnout and not giving a crap coming, and I hope it's not coming before the end of the term. I hope it hits me in mid-June when I can just basically lay in my backyard and be burned out. Until summer term, of course, which I'm teaching summer term as well. But I'll be fine by then, I swear, I promise. But this is a messy diagram, but part of what political reform involves is changing the traditional relationships that we have in existence, and also often being creative. So one of the things that I want to point out to you in terms of your work for developing your own plan is that feel free to be creative, particularly with stuff like this, right? One of the things that city governments are best known for is their diversity of form, right? Our state governments vary from each other, but they're all very similar to the federal model. Almost all of them have bicameral legislatures. All of them have a strong executive. While the veto power varies, some states give governors line item vetoes and the president doesn't have it. There's really the form of the state governments is very similar to the form of the federal government. City governments show a lot more richness of form, and they show a lot more creativity and a lot more of this kind of thing. And part of it is that these sorts of entities built in as both an internal and external check are more possible at the smaller local level because they generally involve community leaders and civic engagement and citizen action. And at the local level, those things are much more possible. One of the ways in which states differ from the federal government, a lot of states, is that state governments tend to have a lot more statewide elected officials than the federal government. The federal government has one nationwide elected official, the president, well, president and vice president, right? We don't elect anybody else at the national level. At the state level, many states, every state has an elected governor, which is the equivalent of the president, but many states have multiple statewide elected positions. The state treasurer, the secretary of state, the state attorney general, the lieutenant governor is often elected separately from the governor as opposed to the vice president is elected in a ticket system with the president. So states already show a diversity of form, even though in general their form is relatively the same. Their electoral systems differ from the federal system in this particular way, and that is largely because it's way easier to have a multiplicity of statewide elected officials than it is to have a multiplicity of nationwide elected officials. Imagine if the United States elected the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Treasury, and the Attorney General. That would mean that we would have that many more national campaigns. Now, what would probably happen is that those people would all run as a ticket, right? There would be the Democratic slate and the Republican slate, and so it wouldn't just be the president and vice president, it would be the president, vice president, Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury, so we'd get all those people up front. And that would be different than it is now because currently the president appoints those people and gets them confirmed by the Senate, so at least the American electorate would have a chance to see who was on the ticket, right? And then the president couldn't fire the Secretary of State or the Secretary of Treasury. The president would have to deal with, for the 4-year term, whoever it was that was put on the party ticket. But it would be messy. At the local level, we can have all kinds of stuff that isn't possible at the national level, and that's maybe not even done at the statewide level, because everybody lives here, right? Imagine a statewide oversight board for the state police. You would want to have that come from all over Oregon, from different communities. We want to have some kind of diversity of representation. And how would they meet? Many people would have to come really far distances. They have a bunch of different concerns. They see things so differently. It could be, at a statewide level, could be cumbersome. A citizen oversight board of the city police is completely doable in terms of not only logistics, but just in terms of we can represent the entire community by pulling people together from the various places and putting them on this board that meets once a week or that meets whenever they have to hear the complaints. And this could be a realistic check on the power of the chief of police or on the power of the mayor, or if there's an oversight board for something else. Very possible. There are other types of extra governmental forms, and I'll just mention one, and that is participatory budgeting. Participatory budgeting is a type of budgeting that sets aside a chunk of the city budget. Not usually a ton, and it's not usually most of it, and it's definitely not the entire budget, but sets aside a certain amount for popular participatory determination of where that money goes. The normal budgeting process for a city is that it's either done by the mayor and with approval of the city council, or it's devised by the city council and voted on by the city council. It's all done from the top. Participatory budgeting is a political reform that proposes that a certain amount of money in the city budget is given over to essentially the equivalent of a citizen review board. and that opportunities for getting on that board, as well as for influencing and meeting with and talking to that board, are way more numerous than are the opportunities for example, getting on the city council or interacting with and influencing members of the city council. So there's, at the city level, there is the possibility for a pretty decent proliferation of forms, of extra governmental forms that fall outside of the normal legislative, executive, and then the relationship between those two. Now, at minimum though, what you're going to have to do, because all the rest of this stuff are add-ons, and they of course are related to what problems you see, as well as what opportunities you want to create in the new electoral system. But at basis, you have to decide, what is the legislative system, what's the executive system, what's the relationship, how are these people going to get elected, and for everyone else who's going to be working in the city government, how are they chosen, right? Now, let me just give you a couple of different examples without being comprehensive about all the different options that are out there for you. Part of your research and part of your participation in the group is finding as many different options as possible so that you can select from among the ones that you think are the best. We currently have a commission system, which is also a weak mayor system, right? Everybody on our city council is elected at large, so that's the electoral system. And the relationship between our legislative and executive is that the mayor is elected exactly the same way that all the city council members are elected, and has one additional power. And that power is that the mayor gets to appoint which city commissioners, which are the city council members, but they're called commissioners, are going to be in charge of which city departments. So if you get elected to city council position 1, you're a city commissioner, and you will then be part of the executive branch. One of the things about the commission system is that the legislative officers, the people who are on the city council, who set the budget, who set policy, who make ordinances, who repeal ordinances, those people are all also the heads of executive departments. And which department they're the head of is up to the mayor. Now, interestingly, to get to be mayor of Portland, you run with the exact same constituency as the people who run for every city council position. And it's the same length of term. It's a 4-year term, elected at large in the entire city of Portland. It's kind of weird, like, well, why wouldn't you just run for mayor? Why would you run for city council position 2 when city council position 2 requires you to campaign to the same set of voters and gives you less power than if you win as mayor? Obviously, there's a difference in what you desire and also in your temperament, but our system has a very small distinction between the mayor and the members of the city council, between the other commissioners. And the mayor is, in fact, a city commissioner as well in terms of functions, just kind of like the lead city commissioner. And we also have the relationship between the legislative and the executive branch is that they are essentially the same people. Now, the city departments are run by people who are chosen. They're chosen, they're hired in a competitive job interview type of system by the city commissioner who runs that city department. So what we don't have is a system where the mayor has a lot of control over who's actually running the departments. Because when you have a commissioner system, the commissioner is usually in charge of multiple city bureaus. You could be in charge of the police, Parks and Recreation, and Housing Development, or even more than that. Department of Transportation, Police, Parks, Water. You could get whatever set of city departments are in your portfolio, depending on what the mayor gives you. But those departments are run by department heads. So there's a police commissioner who's one of our 5 elected officials, and I believe that the current mayor has appointed himself police commissioner. So the police commissioner is elected, but not elected to be the police commissioner. The police commissioner is elected to be a member of the city council or the mayor, and then is appointed by the mayor. And the mayor is allowed to self-appoint. This is another interesting feature of our system. The police department is run by a chief of police, and the chief of police is hired by the police commissioner. Now, we could easily have a system where the police commissioner is elected. Much like we have a system where the state treasurer is elected, and the secretary of state is elected, and the head of the state's school board is elected statewide, right? We could have citywide the police commissioner. Or we could have citywide the Parks and Rec commissioner, or the Department of Transportation commissioner. There's no reason why all the commissioners need to be elected, and there's also no reason why 0 of the commissioners need to be elected. Not every statewide office in the state of Oregon is elected, right? There are plenty of statewide offices that are in fact appointed by the governor, and this is true around the country, and the number of statewide offices that are elected versus appointed varies from state to state. There's no reason why, if you choose to have some of the commissioners, people who are executives, right, running executive departments, because what we have, the executive is we have departments. There's no reason why we couldn't elect the police commissioner. Now, what the police commissioner would then probably be is, and you could set up the power to be this way, is the police commissioner is probably what today the police chief is. That's their job. The police chief is the one who runs the police department, with the commissioner as their boss, who could fire them, right? If you're an elected police commissioner, you could run the police department with no boss above you except for except for the people who elect you or don't elect you next time. Or we could again have a system where the police commissioner is elected and the police commissioner hires and fires the police chief. So the police chief is doing the daily business of running the police department, making all those decisions, signing all the forms, going to all those particular meetings, and is the head of that hierarchy. And the police commissioner is essentially the one-person oversight committee over the police chief. So the police chief has a boss. And then also, when we talk about checks, you could say that the city council has to be consulted before the police chief can be fired. And we can even say before the police chief can be hired, right? This is how chosen, and chosen implies also how replaced, right? So I should probably write that up, how chosen and replaced. So, we could say that the city council gets elected, and just to kind of indicate what one of the choices are, let's just say we want to have a city council of 10 members. We divide this, and they get elected in not citywide, but in districts. We divide the city into 5 equally sized districts, and every district gets 2 members of the city council elected in 4-year terms with 2-year offsets. So if I'm living in District 1, we have 2 members of the city council, and in 2020 we re-elect one of those 2, and in 2022 we re-elect the other one, and they cycle that way. Now you could have synchronized terms as well. You could re-elect both at the same time. These are choices that you have to make, and when you think about the interconnections between all these different forms, you have to play out in your head like, okay, how would that work? Would it be a good idea for District 1 and District 3 and District 5 to get to re-elect all of their people all at once? Or do we want every district to have an election every 2 years? There are different consequences for making those different choices. But we could say we're going to have a city council of 10 members, and the mayor casts the tie-breaking vote if necessary, right? And there's a difference between having a vote and having the tie-breaking vote, right? Much like the vice president of the United States doesn't have a regular vote in the Senate, but casts a tie-breaking vote. You could say, and it's very common in city government forms, that the mayor has only a tie-breaking vote in the city council. So we could say, well, the city council is 10 people with the mayor as a tie-breaking vote. They're elected in districts into 4-year terms that are cycled every 2 years asynchronously. And we elect every 4 years a police commissioner, a head of the Department of Transportation, and a head of the Parks Department. Just for example, we just choose those 3 particular ones, and maybe the budget director. It depends. What do you think needs external check? What do you think needs the people deciding, right? Our federal system doesn't think the people need. I mean, there's no thinking about it, but it doesn't give the people any choice in who the Secretary of State is, right? That's up to the president. In Oregon, the people get to choose who our Secretary of State is. Now, the Secretary of State has a different role at the state level than at the federal level, but they're both very important positions. The Secretary of State in Oregon has to convince voters, right? I just filled out my ballot today, and I had to choose one of the 3 people, and I had to go through and figure out What do I want, right? If we had a system that didn't elect the Secretary of State, that the Secretary of State was appointed by the governor, Kate Brown would do that job. As it is, I have to do that job, or I guess I should say I get to do that job. So we decide who gets elected by the people. Part of what an election is it's the external check, right? How do they get elected? Well, for the police commissioner, it makes sense to be elected citywide. For a mayor, it makes sense to be elected citywide. City council members, you either are elected citywide, or you're elected in districts, or you're elected in a proportional electoral system. Those are really the three main options that are available. And then if you're elected in a district, you can have multi-member districts. Now, one of the reasons to have synchronous voting for, let's say we have a 10-person city council, 5 districts in Portland, and each district gets 2 representatives. If we do asynchronous, we vote one in every 2 years on alternating election cycles. What that means is we have a winner-take-all system. If we elect both of them at the same time, we could have, there are different ways of electing those people. We could have position 1 and position 2, winner take all in each one of them, or we could have first and second place. So everybody runs, 6 people run for District 1, Northeast Portland's 2 seats. The person who comes in first and the person who comes in second both go there. And there's no distinction between them, they both win. Third place person doesn't win, right? So there's a multiplicity of ways that that elections can take place, and then we can use a proportional election system as well. That would introduce parties. We currently don't have parties, and if you think, well, maybe part of the problem with our city government is that the people who run the city council don't represent some kind of ideological constituency because they're not party members. In fact, they're explicitly, through our electoral system, nonpartisan elections. What we really want is we really want to have the diversity of ideas in the city represented on the city council. So let's have a proportional system of PR, right? All these are available, and then we could say, so we're electing our police commissioner. There are certain jobs, like it wouldn't make sense to have a police commissioner for the Northeast District and a police commissioner for the Southeast District. You could do it in theory, but that would be police commissioner by committee, and that would probably be atrocious. Typically, executive departments want to have a hierarchy where you have a person who has final responsibility, potentially with checks. So what we say is this: the police commissioner gets elected. So somebody runs citywide for police commissioner, and what do they run on? They run on their record, their ideas, the policies that they want to pursue, and their constitutional power, I should say their charter power, because it's a city charter, not a city constitution, but their constitutional power is that they can appoint the police chief and that they have veto power over certain kinds of decisions made by the chief of police. But the chief of police basically runs the day-to-day operations, and the police commissioner can only fire the police chief with approval of a majority of the city council. Or, alternatively, the police commissioner can hire and fire the chief of police at will, without any kind of authorization from the city council. You don't always need, just because a check is available in theory, doesn't mean you necessarily want to have that check, right? If we have an elected police commissioner who's going to run solely on policing issues, and the voters can look at that person and say, okay, I'm just going to evaluate. I don't have to care about what your healthcare plan is, what your environmental record is. All I care about is your ideas about policing. Then that person is going to be chosen from an area that is going to be different than, let's say, the mayor, because Ted Wheeler, he's the mayor. People aren't necessarily going to elect him solely on his position on what the Portland police should do. But then he appoints himself police commissioner. So now he's been elected for a lot of reasons, but now he has power over the police commission. Part of the reason why we would elect rather than appoint particular department heads is because we want to give the people the opportunity to choose that specific role. And also, we want to give the people who occupy that role a kind of a more niche responsibility and more niche appeal. Like if you're running for police commissioner, you're going to have to run a citywide campaign, just like mayor. And you're going to have less power than the mayor, but part of what you also have is you have less to run on. You don't have to run on your environmental record. You don't have to run on the homelessness question. I mean, I guess you have to run on the homelessness question if it comes up like, how are you, the police, going to treat homeless people? So yes, you have to run on that. You don't have to run on the question of economic development or housing development. You run on policing issues. what check do we want? So all of this, I'm not giving you at all a comprehensive view about stuff. I'm really just giving you a set of interconnected and very much ad hoc ideas for what reform could look like. Another big form that's available, and this is kind of what I'm talking about, the commissioner, police chief distinction writ large to the whole city government, is the manager council form. We currently have a commissioner form where the mayor is a weak mayor and the city executive departments are run by the city commissioners. So there's no professionalism at the very top, right? The people who are running each executive department are elected officials. Now, I shouldn't say there's no professionalism. It doesn't mean they're not able to be professionals. It means that they are not chosen because they are specific professionals in that area, right? A person who's hired to be the police chief is chosen because they have policing experience. The person who's chosen to be the police commissioner under the system I've just described, where they get directly elected, is elected because they have policing experience and a policing platform. We have a police commissioner who is the mayor, who has neither of those things, right? The mayor was not elected solely on policing issues. Maybe that was part of his platform. It definitely was. It always is. But that's not what most voters are looking at. And so we have a person who has no experience as a police officer, and we have a person who has no experience as a prosecutor or involved in the criminal justice system at all. Then we have a person running the department who's hired by that person who has all that experience. So where do we want the professional experience, and where do we want the sort of popular responsiveness? That's actually one of the big question that goes on. The other form that's available, and that's practiced widely in the United States at a bunch of different levels of government, is the council manager system. And that's where we have a directly elected legislature, and usually a mayor, but it's usually either a weak mayor or even just purely a ceremonial mayor, and then a city manager. And the city manager is hired to run the executive departments on a day-to-day basis. So it's what many people think of as what a mayor does, but it's an appointed mayor, and we call this a city manager. And usually there are in fact city manager training programs. Like you get college degrees in this, you can get a graduate degree, and there are certifications. And so usually city charters that have city managers actually have a set of professional requirements. Like I couldn't become the city manager just because somebody liked me and thought, oh yeah, you can be the city manager. It's actually a sort of trained professional position. And then the question around the city manager is, so basically what we're saying is, well, we want the day-to-day operation of our executive branch to be in the hands of a trained professional, and to be overseen, to have the department heads be overseen not by an elected official, but by a trained professional who themselves is overseen by the elected officials. How does the city manager get appointed? How can the city manager be removed? These are questions that have multiple answers to them, right? In some systems, the mayor appoints the city manager, and then that city manager has to be approved by a majority of the city council. And that is kind of like say we elect a president, and then that president appoints somebody who run the executive branch. And that person who gets appointed, let's just call it the CEO of the executive branch, has to be approved by the Senate. But then that person has that job, unless they're recalled by the voters or unless they're impeached by the House and then removed by the Senate. So once you decide on a chosen method, then you have to have the connection also has to be, well, how can they be replaced? Many city managers are chosen by the mayor, or essentially nominated by the mayor, because they then have to be endorsed by, approved by the city council. Other systems have it where the city council appoints the mayor. That's a little messier because then you have a group of people trying to appoint one person. It makes a lot more sense just systemically to have a mayor nominate the manager and then have the council either approve or disapprove of that. So the manager council system puts technical professional expertise essentially at the top of the executive branch, and then creates a kind of an internal checking relationship with the legislative branch. And then in that system, unlike ours, where our city commissioners not only are the legislative branch, they also head the executive departments, even though they don't run them on a day-to-day basis, they still hire the people who run them and they can fire them. The legislative branch acts just like we were familiar with the legislative branch being. They make the policies. They set the laws and the ordinances. They set the budget. That's their job. They are legislators only. Our system mixes. The relationship in our system is a strong mixture between these two. And the only citywide officials that we elect are the city council members, the mayor being sort of one of them with an extra power that other council members don't. Now, hopefully what you see from this, I could probably go on with examples for another 2 hours, and I absolutely do not want to go on for 2 hours. I don't even want to go on for much more than 5 minutes or so. But what I hope you see is that there are a lot of different ways to do these, to set up a city government, and to create the roles, to decide who selects them, are they appointed, who appoints them, how can they be removed, what do our elections look like, what's the relationship between the legislative and the executive branch, and then what are the extra governmental forms? Are we going to have a citizen review board that actually is going to, rather than the chief of police and the police commissioner handling complaints about police behavior, we could say, well, there's an external power that when there's a citizen complaint about a police officer, that complaint goes to the citizen review board. It doesn't go to the police chief, it doesn't go to the police commissioner, it goes to someone else. The police are particularly susceptible, I shouldn't say susceptible, are particularly desired as a target for this kind of external, you think of it as an auditor, like an auditor role of a citizen auditor board. Most city governments have various auditors throughout them. We have a city auditor who is like, I don't know if our city auditor is appointed or elected. I really ought to know. It's actually in the report, and I forget. There's so many things that are easy to forget about these very complex systems of government. But what I want to point out is that one, you have just a ton of decisions to make. It doesn't mean it's impossible to make them, but there's a lot of diversity as to how these things can be organized. So one, use your creativity. Don't just think about the national government as the model for what a city government should look like. There's a lot of ways that you can play around with appointment versus election, relationships between the different offices, internal and external checks, electoral forms. The thing that is super important, especially when you're putting together a broad-based reform like a new city charter, as opposed to a more targeted reform like mail-in balloting or a dual executive or mandatory voting or most of the ones you guys did for your speeches were great because they were targeted. This particular type of political reform, changing an entire city government's charter, is not just one issue. It's a bunch of things. And the interconnections are going to be very important. And then the other concept is the trade-offs. Always pay attention to what you're getting and what you're giving up when you make a particular choice. So, for example, electing the police commissioner. What are you getting? Well, what you're getting is popular control over the top of a very important executive department. You're getting a kind of a direct form of citizen oversight. This person has to run for re-election every 4 years, and that's a very powerful external check. You're also getting, because we're electing the city commissioner, the police commissioner, instead of having that person appointed or by, from among, the current system we have is really not, is far from the best. But what you're also getting is you're getting an office where the people who will run for that office have enough experience and ideas that they could legitimately run for and win that office, right? If you've never done anything to do with policing, if you've never had anything to do with the criminal justice system at all, right? Either as a lawyer or as a police officer or as a citizen advocate, it's going to be very difficult to get elected to that position. Not that people won't, the bike party will undoubtedly run somebody for police commissioner because the bike party is going to run somebody for everything, almost certainly in whatever new form of government the Portland City has. But the bike party candidate for police commissioner is almost certainly not going to be a viable candidate, right? But the bike party's candidate for mayor is never a viable candidate. It's never someone who's going to win. At least it hasn't been so far. I don't want to predict the future entirely. But what you do get is you get a police commissioner who comes to the electorate with experience, character, and policies that are related to that job. Currently, we have a police commissioner with none of that stuff, right? And that doesn't mean that Ted Wheeler is a bad police commissioner. It just means that he doesn't come to that job with any of these traits. What we're getting when we elect the police commissioner is that. Okay? What we're giving up, depending on how we structure what the police commissioner's power over the police chief is, and maybe the police commissioner is the police chief, right? Like we actually just say the police commissioner runs the day-to-day operations and can only be removed from office by some kind of impeachment process or by losing re-election in 4 years. But for 4 years, we have the same police commissioner / police chief. What we're giving up in that case is control, but also what we're giving up is having a person who's not a politician running the police bureau, right? So whenever you use elections as opposed to selections, what you're giving up is essentially having a non-politician doing a certain kind of job. Now, in a democracy, you're going to have, this is part of the cost of doing business in a democracy, you're going to have an awful lot of politicians doing jobs. And being able to get elected is often a very different skill than being able to do the job, right? Like, in fact, this is a problem with our presidency. Our presidents, the presidents of the United States, they're better than anyone else at winning the presidency. And that's a high level of skill. Like, this is one thing about Donald Trump is that like there have been 45 presidents, and not even all of them have been elected. 40 or so people in the 200 plus years have been good enough to win the presidency. That's hard. That's really hard. I couldn't do it. No one else could do it, right? People who think they're so much smarter than Donald Trump, they couldn't get elected president. Now, that doesn't mean that you're going to be good at doing the job you win the election for. And that's one of the, I would say, problematic perversities of a democracy, is that getting hired for the job means winning an election. And the hiring process is not necessarily related to being able to do the job well. So when we elect the police commissioner, instead of having the police commissioner appointed through some other mechanism, we are getting a politician. In other words, we're getting a person who's capable of swaying voters. Now, it's possible that that politicians and at lower levels of office, it's more likely that the thing that gets you elected also makes you good at doing that job, right? But there's not a necessary connection. We can't make sure that the person who appeals to the most voters is actually going to be the person who's going to do the best job. So that's what you're giving up. You're also potentially, if we have a police commissioner who's elected by the people, and we choose to have that person run the day-to-day operation of the police department, what we're giving up is we're giving up the ability for somebody to fire that person, right? We have to get rid of a police commissioner that turns out to be a disaster or a disappointment now requires a more cumbersome impeachment removal process, or waiting until the next election to vote them out of office. You lose the ability, when you have an elected head of a department, to get rid of that person should they prove to be ineffective, should they prove to be corrupt but short of illegally corrupt, where they can actually just be removed for illegalities, who is maybe just decides, who's not responsive, or who changes their mind. They ran on Platform A, they get the job, they act in a way that's totally against Platform A, and people are just like, wait a minute, we elected you to do this, how did you do this, right? We don't like that. You give up when you have an elected official with a certain level of electoral immunity until the next cycle. You give up that kind of check over that person. So this is just one of, again, innumerable examples of the trade-offs. So when you're thinking about reform, always you're going to have to think about trade-offs. But when you're thinking about reform for an entire city charter, you have to think about the interconnections, and you also have to think definitely about the trade-offs for the choices that you're making. This all might sound enormous and very challenging and potentially even impossible. And yeah, that's true. But part of the lesson here is that that's what political reform of this type, not all political reform involves such a systemic change as rewriting a city charter, but this one particular kind is enormous, and it's a daunting task. So part of what I hope you get out of this is a respect for the challenge of actually coming up with a plan that's going to have a lot of interconnections, and you're going to have to make trade-offs. You're going to say, oh shit, do we want an elected police chief, or do we want an appointed police chief by a commissioner who's appointed by, some of these choices could potentially be very anguishing and challenging to make, and there is really no right answer. The only thing you can do is reference back what your problems are and say, okay, here's what we're getting and here's what we're giving up, and the thing we're getting is connected to the problem that we think we really want to face, right? And I used the police as an example throughout this, mostly just because I know that many people, all city governments care about the police, or people who are city government reformers, and particularly in Portland, the way the police are run and the way they behave is definitely, it's a top issue for the electorate and for citizens in general, even people who don't vote. So it's one area, but I could have used as an example instead the head of the Department of Transportation, because that's also, especially in a fast-growing city like Portland, that's also an extremely important job and a difficult job. Do we have an elected person? Do we have an appointed person? Right? Currently, the head of our Department of Transportation is a member of the City Council who was appointed by the mayor to head that without necessarily any relevant experience or even a platform in that, right? Like, you don't run to be the head of the Department of Transportation. You run to be a city commissioner, and then one of the city commissioners gets that job. So I think it's pretty easy, and the report does a pretty good job of pointing out why it is that our city commission system is actually far from the optimal one. But what improves on that system? Even if we say, well, definitely we need a new system. What improves on it? And then every choice we make potentially has greater trade-offs. If we talk about a legislative, we want a bigger city council. Well, do we want it to be 10 or 30 or 15? There are benefits and problems with every size city council. I mean, a city council of 5 is, for a city the size of ours, is sort of criminally small. So we know that that's too small. But what would be a good size? What would be a good size for the next, say, 80 years, right? Because when you do a city charter, you're probably going to be doing it for a chunk of decades, right? Maybe just 40 years. Think about a scope of 40 years. All right, so that's, like I said, I could go on. I could have innumerable examples of the kinds of choices that you're going to have to make. But I think this at least sets up the terrain of what it is that you're doing. I hope it's clear about the schedule changes and how you're supposed to go about the next 3 weeks of life in this particular class. All right, well, that's it for today, and that's it for this week. And really, this is the last lecture I'm going to give to this class until the very final class. I'm going to do a kind of a wrap-up lecture. Hopefully, it will be a manageable task for me, and then I'll be up to the task by week 10. But until the end of week 10, this is the last you're going to see of me in this particular format. And maybe that's a bummer to you, and maybe that makes you extremely happy. And in both of those cases, it's true that I will not be seeing my camera as a stand-in for you guys for another couple weeks. So I hope that what we do instead is actually a really fun, educational, handleable exercise for you.